In this video, we're going over dynamic inventory with Ansible and AWS EC2 instances. There will be a follow-up video on how to use dynamic inventories in Ansible with Azure VMs. And if you're not familiar with what a dynamic inventory is in Ansible, normally we have an inventory file where we specify IP addresses or DNS host names, and this is the host that we would like to run Ansible against. However, if those resources do not exist yet, maybe we want to use Ansible to create these resources, we need a way to update our inventory with those resources after the fact. Before we can begin configuring dynamic inventories within AWS EC2, we first have to meet some prerequisites. We have to install some software. We'll begin by installing Python 3, and then we need to install Python 3-pip. And then using pip3, we need to install the Boto3 library, which will enable us to interact with the AWS API. Now I am on an Ubuntu Debian-based system, so I am going to be using sudo apt install python 3, sudo apt install python 3-pip, and sudo pip3 install boto3. And as you can see on my screen, I have those all installed already, and that is what is required in order to interact with the AWS API. Also, if you're following along with this video step by step, you will also need to install the AWS CLI on your Ansible control node. And I will leave a link in the description on the instructions to do this because it varies by distribution. The last prerequisite thing we need to do is we need to enable the AWS _EC2 plugin within our Ansible.config file. So I'm going to go ahead to etc Ansible.config. And I'm going to edit this. And you're going to come down to the inventory section. And for you, this may be commented out, but you need to take this entire line up here, all these plugins, right after the colon. So hostless, script, auto, YAML, INI, and toml. And just go ahead, and if this line is commented out for you, uncomment it. Make sure all these plugins are enabled, and then also ensure you add the AWS _EC2 plugin, because if you don't, we won't be able to use the AWS EC2 plugin for dynamic inventories. And now we're ready to start using dynamic inventories with Ansible and AWS EC2. So before you can get started with dynamic inventory in AWS, you have to deploy some EC2 instances. I've already deployed a couple using Terraform code. I'll include a link in the description to the Terraform code if you're interested. It's a quick way to deploy some EC2 instances, but I've got 2 Red Hat development machines and 2 Ubuntu dev machines. And the important thing here is that whatever ones you create, you just want to make sure you have some tags associated, right? So I have my Ubuntu machines, they have an operating system tag with values of Ubuntu, and the Red Hat ones have an operating system tag of value Red Hat. And that's going to become important later in this example when I go over groups. Once your instances are deployed and you're ready to begin using dynamic inventory with those instances, we need to go ahead and create a dynamic inventory file. So go ahead and create a directory. I've created one here called Ansible Dynamic Inventory. And go ahead and create a file. And this file is going to be our dynamic inventory file. And we're going to go ahead and I'm going to expand this, right? The first thing we need to do is specify the plugin that we want to use. So if you remember earlier in our prerequisites section, we went to the Ansible.config file and we had to specify enable plugins AWS _EC2. Well, here in this inventory file is where we're going to specify that plugin. And this is saying for this inventory, I would like to use the AWS EC2 plugin. So once we've configured a plugin, such as the AWS EC2 plugin, we need to then tell that plugin what AWS account we're going to connect to query for instances. So we have a couple different ways to do this. So we could specify AWS access key in here and AWS secret key, right? And this is going to be our AWS access key ID and then the secret key that goes along with it. And this is one way to do it. And the advantages of doing it this way are you can take this file to any Ansible control node and you don't have to swap out the credentials. The disadvantages are your credentials are sitting in a file, which is not so secure, right? So another way to do it, and the way I'm going to do it in this example, is I'm going to use the AWS profile option. Now, and then I specify a profile name. In this case, I'm going to specify default. So now I'm telling the AWS EC2 plugin, use the AWS profile that's configured on this machine with the name of default. And this is where the AWS CLI comes into play that we installed earlier in the prerequisites. So if I do an AWS configure, as long as I have the AWS CLI installed, I can configure the access key ID, the secret access key to that ID, the region, default region I would like to connect to in the output format. And that all goes into an AWS profile. So if I cd to the home directory .aws of this user, I've got a folder in here, or a file called credentials. And if I look at that file, right, I can see a profile name with these credentials configured. So profile name default, I want to use AWS profile default. And now I need to establish regions that I would like to use for dynamic inventory polling, right? What regions would I like to search for instances in? So I'm going to go ahead and specify regions, and I'm going to pass a list of my regions here. And right now I'm just going to do US-East-1 because that is the only region that I have instances in. I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to go back to my inventory here directory where my AWS EC2.yaml is. And now I can save this file and I'm ready to begin polling a dynamic inventory, right? So I'll go ahead and I'll do Ansible-inventory and I'll pass this inventory that I just created. And I'm going to do a -- list. And what -- list is going to do is it's going to pull all of the instances and it's going to return all the parameters for those instances. So you can see here, I got AWS EC2 host. It's returned all my hosts and all these different parameters. Now, this is a lot of output, right? To simplify it, we'll do a -- graph. And what this is going to do is it's going to return a tree-like graph for us. And it's more simplified and it's cleaner, right? Now, there's two issues with this output here. And the first one being that there's only one host group, right? AWS EC2. And that's fine if that's all you want to use. But generally, you want to be able to break hosts out by different attributes, right? Are they a different operating system, different architecture? Do they have different purposes, right? And the second issue here is if you notice, these are private IP addresses, right? So our dynamic inventory is being returned with the private IP addresses. And this is not good because if Ansible uses a dynamic inventory out and tries to connect to these IP addresses from an external network, like I'm attempting to connect to AWS over the internet from my house, I can't connect to these IP addresses. I need either a valid DNS host name or a public IP address. So first, to address the host name issue, we have the ability to define host names and in our inventory. And this parameter has different settings that we can use to choose how we would like the host name to be displayed for use during dynamic inventory, right? So if I just specify IP address, this option is going to allow me to display these IP addresses with the public IP address. So now if I do Ansible inventory, pass my inventory -- graph again, you can see that I'm now getting the public IP addresses, which is good because that means if I attempt to connect to these instances with this dynamic inventory, Ansible will now be able to connect because it has a way to connect from outside the network. And this second issue of everything in one group, we can solve through, well, there's two ways we can solve this, right? So we have these things called keyed groups, and we can also just use groups. So first I'll show you how keyed groups works, right? So keyed groups comes in a prefix and a key format, right? So we'll have prefix, and a prefix is going to be the name of the host group that's going to be concatenated with the key underneath it. So I'll just do one as an example so you can kind of see what I mean by that. So I'll say prefix arc, right? And then for key, I want architecture. And this is based on that dash dash list output, right? So again, if I do a dash dash list, I get a bunch of parameters back, right? But one of these parameters somewhere in here is going to be architecture. Network instances. Anyway, I'll do another example you see, right? So I'm going to go ahead and save this, and then I'll do a dash dash graph again. But what this is going to do is it's going to create host groups based on architecture. So you can see that I now have a new host group called arc_x8664. So what happened here was Ansible and AWS worked together to take this prefix, arc, and concatenate it with the architecture. Now I only have one architecture. Everything's x8664 here. That's why they're all showing up under this host group. If I change this to, let's just say archy, and run again, you can see that it now says archy x8664. So we're confirming that prefix is just being concatenated with the key here. So we'll do a dash dash list again, and we can see here we have some different options here. So let's pick, you know what? I say let's pick availability zone. Okay, so I'll create a prefix of AZ, and I'll do placement, right? Because I believe that is a valid parameter option here. Placement, placement, placement. Okay, so we have placement and availability zone. So what I can do is, if I would like to group these by availability zone, I can do placement dot availability zone, just as it's laid out here. So placement dot availability zone, save, and we'll do graph. And now we should have two different groups because I have two different availability zones. And there we have it. We have keyed groups separated by availability zone. Now, that's one way to create groups. But generally, people prefer to create groups based on tags as well, right? So we can do that just using the groups option. So if I type groups here, right? And then if we go back to, you can see here that I have the OS key with the value Red Hat, and then the Ubuntu machines are going to have the OS key with the value Ubuntu. I can create a group Red Hat and a group Ubuntu. And this is going to be specified. So if you do it like this, right, it's Jinja 2 syntax formatting. So quotations, right, the string that I would like to look for in the value Red Hat, in tags dot, and then the key, right? So here I'm saying look for the string in the value field of Red Hat in tags dot key, key being OS. Every value of Red Hat that matches the key OS will be in group Red Hat. And then I'm going to do the same here for Ubuntu. In tags.os. So now if I do the dash dash graph, I should get two host groups, one for host with the tag Red Hat and host with the tag Ubuntu. And here we have it. Now I do have 6 machines here, but 2 of them are actually part of an EKS cluster, so they're not tagged the same way that the Ubuntu and Red Hat machines are tagged. Now that we've created this dynamic inventory and we verified it works, how do we use it to connect to the instances that are gathered in the dynamic inventory? Well, first we have to tell Ansible how we want to connect. So in this particular example, I'm focusing on the groups Red Hat and Ubuntu. So we did the dash dash graph and we got the groups back, Red Hat and Ubuntu. And I want to be able to connect to those two groups, but they have different keys and different users. So what I need to do, right, is, well, first I need to create a playbook that I would like to run against these hosts. So I'm going to create a new file, and I'm going to call it ping playbook.yaml. And this is going to be a very simple playbook. So we're just going to have one play. So it's going to be ping dynamic inventory, right? And I'm going to specify hosts. And right now we'll just go with the Red Hat host. And then we'll have our tasks, if I can spell. All right, then we'll say ping dynamic inventory, and we'll just use the ping module. And that's it. That's a valid playbook for the ping module. So Ansible is going to attempt to connect these hosts, log in, and then ping, return an output, right? This is how we can verify that we can successfully log in. So now I need to create a directory here called group vars. And within this directory, I'm going to create two files. I'm going to create a file for each group of interest. So I've got the Red Hat.yaml group, and I'm going to have the Ubuntu group. So I'm going to have the Ubuntu.yaml. And within each of these, I need to specify, well, you really only need to specify two things, but I'm going to specify three things. So I need to specify the Ansible SSH private key file. So what key am I going to use to connect to the Red Hat host? So I'm going to use the Red Hat -dev -key. And before I forget, I'm actually going to pull in these private keys for the Ubuntu and the Red Hat host, and I have them on this host. So I'm going to pull them into this directory. So I have them. I'm going to copy them from wherever they are, Red Hat to here, and Ubuntu. Yep. And now I have the credentials required in this directory. So back to what we were doing, I need to specify an Ansible SSH. Oh, I can't spell apparently. User, and for the Red Hat host, it's going to be ec2-user. And then one more thing I'm going to specify is Ansible SSH common args. And I'm going to do -o strict host key checking equals no. And what this is going to do is the first time you connect to a host, it asks you if you would like to add the key to the known host file. I'm just going to turn that off because it's going to get in the way of the automation for the example. This isn't recommended for a production environment. It's not secure, but to each their own, right? And actually, let me capital H. All right. And I'm just going to copy all this here. And I'm going to go to the Ubuntu group vars, and I'm going to paste that, and I'm going to change the file to Ubuntu dev key. And for the Ubuntu host, the user is actually Ubuntu, and we're going to keep the strict host key checking equals no. So now I've told the dynamic inventory, Red Hat, and Ubuntu host groups what credentials to use when we attempt to connect. So when I specify host Red Hat in the playbook and I run it, Ansible is going to pull the EC2 inventory. It's going to create a group for Red Hat, and then it's going to attempt to connect to the Red Hat host using the group vars Red Hat.yaml file, credentials and user. So let's go ahead and verify this real quick. So I'm going to do an Ansible. I'm going to clear the screen actually, and I'll bring this up. I'm going to do an Ansible -playbook. Just pass my inventory, and then the playbook I would like to run. So Ansible is reaching out to AWS. It's getting all the hosts. It's creating a Red Hat group, and then it's attempting to connect to the Red Hat host group using the credentials in group vars for Red Hat.yaml. And there we have it. We have a success. So Ansible successfully connected to these hosts. And let's test the Ubuntu one. So it's the same command. And there we have a success for the Ubuntu host group. Now, there is one other thing I would like to show you. So this is rather inefficient, right? I could specify both host groups here, right? And then if I ran this command, it would technically connect to both Ubuntu and Red Hat. But what if I wanted to create a parent group and then group these two underneath them? Or what if I wanted to combine a static inventory with my dynamic inventory? Well, you're in luck because that's possible. So I'm actually going to create a host group here called Linux. So I'm going to specify I want to run this playbook against the Linux host group. I'm going to create a new file, and I'm going to call this static inventory.yaml. And in here, I'm going to create, let's create the Ubuntu and the Red Hat host groups, right? But then let's also create the Linux parent group, and we're going to say it has children, and the children will be whatever's in the Ubuntu. Let me bring this down a little. And the Red Hat group, right? So we're going to combine this static inventory with this dynamic inventory, and then the dynamic inventory is actually going to work together with the static inventory, and they're going to kind of meld together. You need to be careful when you do this though, because there is a precedence to how variables are applied, and when you start combining inventory files, you really want to be cognizant and aware of how that precedence is taking place. But now that I've got my two inventory files created, let's go ahead and let's do an Ansible-inventory. And then we're going to pass our static inventory and another -i option for our EC2 dynamic inventory. And I'll do a --graph. And now you should see me get back a Linux host group with Red Hat and Ubuntu as the children host groups. And I do. So now I'm going to run my playbook again, but I'm also going to specify another inventory here. So another -i static. And now, because I've specified in the playbook that I would like to ping the Linux host group, I should ping both the Red Hat and Ubuntu because they're both children groups in the static inventory of the Linux host group. And there we have it.